Hi, well, the first thing I want to say about these Mont Marte paints is the bigger tubes are in fact 100 ml for $6.95, which is incredibly cheap compared to Winsor & Newton and AS Art Spectrum. Also, I managed to drop this particular tube when I got out of the shop, and it's split, so this material isn't very strong, but that was my fault. The good thing about these paints is they very clearly mark the transparency and the brilliance and the light fastness of the paint. So the number of stars indicates how light fast the colour is. Let me see if I'm saying that right. Yes, and the light fastness indicates its duration over time, because sunlight will actually fade colours, and so the more stars, the longer it's going to last. So the yellow ochre's got 3 stars, which is supposed to be excellent. The highest number of stars is 4. So what I was trying to do, I was trying to get just the Zorn colours or something close to it, and the best I could do was to get the Mars black. Normally I use carbon black, yellow ochre, a brilliant red, so that should be okay. They run out of titanium white, so I had to go over to the box set, which is pretty good value for money depending on the quality of the paints. $11. Each tube is 18 ml, so they're small tubes, but really the combination of these small tubes, all the various colours, and the addition of yellow ochre and maybe a larger tube of white, and you've covered your Zorn palette. And quite often you may want a brilliant green or a blue, which is difficult to get with just the Zorn palette. So the combination, if the paints are okay, that the combination should be pretty good. So what I'm going to do is to do some painting. The first thing I've noticed is that these tubes flex very easily, which indicates that the painted side isn't very stiff, which is probably a bad sign, indicating there's a lot more of the carrier medium, a lot more oil than there is actual paint particles, so that's not a good sign. But it's incredibly cheap compared to the other stuff, so to me it's all down to the brilliance and how it flows when you're painting, and what sort of coverage you can get. So let's see how we go. Right, so what I'm going to compare is the paints I normally use with these cheap Mont Marte paints, and what I've been using for my Zorn red is Spectrum red, and I'm squeezing the tube, which gives me some indication of how thick the paint is. This is the small tube from the set. It seems to be easy to move around. That seems to be quite thick. This is much looser. I'm using Langridge Carbon Black. I actually love these Langridge paints, and they are cheaper, slightly cheaper than Art Spectrum and Winsor & Newton. They're Australian made, and they're supposed to be handmade, and they really do have a brilliant colour. So this is the carbon black I like to use. It's a very powerful black, very dense. Right, this small tube is ivory black, which should be pretty similar to the carbon black. A feature of the carbon black, I think, is when you mix it with white, you get a bluish grey, which is good for things like eyes. Right, now I don't know if it's through age, but the Art Spectrum titanium white is very, very thick, which is the way I like it. And this Mont Marte, once again, isn't very dense. So, as I was saying before, the number of stars indicates the light fastness, and the black circle indicates how opaque it is. When it's a full black circle, it's very opaque, and transparent colours are a little white blob, and sort of semi-transparent is half and half. On these other tubes, this says semi-opaque. The label covers that, so I've no idea how opaque that is. And this says opaque. So you do get the same information on all the various tubes, but it's nice and clear on the Mont Marte. Right, so I think I'll start painting. So the first thing I'll use, I think, is the Mont Marte Brilliant Red. And it's got a little piece of tape over it. That's the Mont Marte Brilliant Red. And here's the Spectrum Red. Well, you can see straight away that the Spectrum Red is far denser. Forget about that oil that's dripping down. Quite often you get that with expensive paints as well. But you can see that this is much more like toothpaste. And the coverage of that seems to be okay. It's a nice bright red, so that's pretty good. The Art Spectrum, you can feel that it's denser. It's difficult to know if the coverage is better or worse. I think the coverage is slightly better. The question being, with that kind of price difference, what's the best bang you get for your buck? Right, so now I'm doing the finger test. That's what I normally get. This piece of MDF is terrible, but it shouldn't really affect. Right, well, the distribution of the red of my finger looks pretty good. I mean, the colour's slightly different, but one's called brilliant red and one's called spectrum red, so can't really tell. Yeah, the art spectrum is definitely a superior. It's got a superior feel to it. But in terms of brilliance, they're both very similar. So I've got no problem with that. Right, the art spectrum yellow ochre. Once again, it's a very dense paint. The big tube, the 100 ml tube of the Mont Marte. Okay, well that looks to be pretty dense. It's almost identical in denseness, so that's good. The spread is good on the art spectrum. The brilliance and spread is good on the Mont Marte. So far, I'm quite impressed. I think the Mont Marte coverage is in fact slightly better than the art spectrum. Right, well, this is my very high quality, I love this stuff, Langridge carbon black. It's going to be very hard to compare blacks because, well, black is black, isn't it? It's a lack of colour. So you'd expect it to have a very good coverage. Okay, once again, that's kind of watery. It's definitely not as dense. So this is carbon black, the Langridge. Now that is such a strong black colour. Really, really intense. Okay, we're not strictly comparing apples with apples. This is ivory black. And it's much waterier, but it's still a very dense black. So, I mean, the way I paint, I use my fingers a lot. So really, from my perspective, it's going to be down to how the paint moves when I'm using my fingers. But okay, the Langridge is definitely more intense black, but that could be due to the fact this is an ivory black and this is a carbon black. But once again, the price difference is huge. Okay, the art spectrum. Titanium white. This is really thick. I love it. The Mont Marte or Mont Marte titanium white. Now, white is, you use it a lot. You want a quality white. Once again, you can see straight away that it's not as dense. Okay, my fingers are dirty now, but it shouldn't detract. I mean, that spreads really nicely. That language white. Right, it's this titanium white, this Mont Marte titanium white looks to me to be more transparent than the art spectrum titanium white. And with titanium white, you buy it because you don't want transparency. But once again, you know, is the difference that huge? What happens when you actually merge it with other colours? When you blend, what's it feel like to blend? Well, because it's a bit wetter, it's not blending so easily. Look at this beautiful blend over here, and I'm finding it difficult to get that kind of blend over here. And that's really, I think, down to the density of the paint. This is just flowing too much for my liking. So let's bring in some black. That kind of bluey grey there is the bluest that you'll get with the Zorn palette. Right, let's try the yellow ochre with the red. Okay, I've got a bit of black in there, but doesn't matter. I'm just looking at how they blend together. So the exact colours I don't really care about. But you can really see the difference in brilliance in those two reds there. The yellow ochres seem to be very similar, actually. So For the price, so far, in this quick test, the Mont Marte is not bad. But when I'm using my finger, blending with my finger, and presumably the same with the brush, I do much prefer the more expensive paints. Let's try with the black brush. Right, this is so the paints on the right of the actually the $11 to $14 expensive paints for 40 mils. So what I normally do when I have this kind of transition and I want to blend it in, I will then move to using my fingers. So the bottom line, I think, is, do you want to spend the extra money to get that slight improvement in the body feel and the slight improvement with some of the colours in brilliance? I mean, this red is a very nice red. This one is a bit wishy-washy. So I think what I'm going to do now, in the second part of this video, I'll actually do a painting using the Mont Marte paints. So that's the real test. What's the finished product going to be looking like? But in terms of the Zorn palette, I'm quite impressed. Certainly cheaper, and maybe in an art class where you're perhaps providing the materials for beginner painters, you're not being cheap by using the Mont Marte paints. Well, not too cheap anyway. Great. Thanks for watching.